Okay, good morning, everyone. So today I want to talk to you about what we can learn about land subsidence and how can this inform adaptation to sea level rise. So first of all, I want to show you a little video of one of our study sites. This is an island that is flooded at high tide nowadays in the Philippines. We have a virtual reality headsets in the poster session, so please come and see this and you can actually experience this. Acknowledge my co-authors. So the work I'm going to be presenting is co-authored by many people. The ones in red are actually in the conference, so some of them will be giving presentations, so you can see some more details. Yesterday, people talked about Jakarta, and as you will be aware by now, Jakarta is sinking very rapidly because of groundwater extraction by up to about 20 centimeters per year in some areas. I'll be talking about that and Tokyo. Another presentation yesterday explained how Tokyo has subsided in the past and now is below, some areas of Tokyo are below mean sea water level. In Jakarta, our case study is in the north side, of course, close to the sea. They started trying to defend this area by making a small dike, small little wall that you can see here in the presentation, and this was already flooded in 2007. So what they did is every time it gets flooded, they increase the size of this little wall. And here you can see a video what the area looks like. It's an impoverished area in Jakarta. You can see the small concrete wall that protects the area from being flooded. And you can see a bigger concrete dike being built out. So the solution of Jakarta is actually to make the area safe by building outwards and higher. And the case of Tokyo, what can we learn from? In Tokyo, land has subsided by about 4 meters. Tokyo was also flooded in the past, for example, in 1917 during the passage of a typhoon. Nowadays, because of land subsiding, if some areas of Tokyo weren't protected by a dike, the entire area would be flooded. And here you can see the current, what the area looks like and what the water levels would be according to just the high tides or some of the historical storm surges. You saw a similar slide yesterday about what Tokyo looks like, some of these areas. So if this dike was breached, all the area behind it would be flooded. So what can we learn by looking at Tokyo and Jakarta? These cities didn't learn from each other, but they went through similar sequence. So in Tokyo, they started by building a small concrete wall. You can see in the slide here. Jakarta, they did the same thing. And if you go to Miami these days, they're doing the same thing. Now, what happens then? Of course, as the land continues to subside, water can no longer drain into the ocean by gravity. So in Tokyo, they built pumps. In Jakarta, they built pumps. And in Miami, they started to build pumps. Then the next stage that you see in adaptation is that you start to build gates to control the flow of water. In Tokyo, they build this, of course, also to do with storm surges. In Jakarta, they start to build similar structures. The next stage in adaptation, you start to do land reclamation projects and actually elevate the land. And this happened in Tokyo. It happened in Jakarta. So you start to actually go into the sea. So you advance and not actually retreat. The next thing that we saw yesterday in Tokyo was that what they do is old areas that were below water level actually get demolished, and you start to make the ground higher and rebuild on top of them. And in Tokyo, they have a plan to, where's this moving? They have a plan to do about 120 kilometers, and they've completed about 30% of that. So in Tokyo already, they've done a large part of what they would like to do, of course, and this is partly to do with flooding, not sea level rise, but they've completed a large part. And in Tohoku, I will show you later, in an area of northern Japan, what they're doing. Of course, this is all very expensive. We did some cost estimates of what it would take just to raise the existing dikes, never mind super levees or super dikes, just by computing, and also just to raise the land to compensate for sea level rise. And we came, of course, you come up with billions of dollars, just something like $3 billion just to compensate in the next 100 years. So that's not improving things. It would be just to maintain the current level of risk. As you know, in 2011 in Japan, there was an earthquake and tsunami. Because of the earthquake, the land subsided by up to 1 meter. And this is what happened in port areas at the time. They got flooded during high tide. So what people did is they got some gravel, put it on top of the existing port, and resurfaced. So you can see how people will adapt in the future to raising water levels. You can see another section, a different port. Again, the same thing, flooded at high tide. So this was a car park. What they did, throw some gravel on top and just eventually resurface. So this is just adaptation to 1 meter. Of course, this is in an instant, it's an earthquake, but it can show you what will happen. Now, in other areas, in the same area, what they want to do is to compensate for, as a countermeasure against tsunamis, they've started to increase the level of the ground of entire towns and villages. So along hundreds of kilometers of the Japanese coastline, they're elevating towns by between 5 and 10, 15 meters. And you can see in the slide at the bottom, the size of people, and all you can see that green mound, if you want, is by how much they've elevated the ground. So in this town, in Rikusentakata, by about 15 meters. An entire town of about 40, 50,000 people. How they did this? They built conveyor belts, they chopped the mountains, and transported entire mountains onto the coastline. So you can actually do things like this if you are prepared to pay the money. Of course, Japan spends about 10% of its annual GDP doing this. Here, this is one of our study sites. It's the town of Kirikiri. It's a little village of about 10, 20,000 people. And the red dot is from where I'm taking the video. And what you can see, I guess, is what the town looks like now after the elevation has been completed. So here, what you see in the distance is the newly elevated town. Of course, if you go nowadays, it's difficult to see, but all that has been elevated by about 10 meters in this case. Of course, what happens to ports then? I'm a coastal engineer, we build ports. If you go to Indonesia, the ports, this is Sunda Kelapa port, you can see an area of the port and then how it's been, how they've taken a short-term countermeasure to compensate with higher water levels, and it's just building this small little wall. Of course, what happens when this gets higher? Well, what they do periodically in this port is they elevate sections. So as they have money, they elevate an entire section of the port. So here you can see the one section that I was showing you earlier and the new section that's been elevated. They're spending about 20% of their income to elevate, to compensate for about 7 to 10 centimeters subsidence per year. Technology that they're using, sheet piles, gravel on top, resurface. So very simple technology. Of course, then what happens to the areas behind, the areas that have been elevated? Well, like this, they get flooded. Here you can see one of the new areas of the port that's been elevated with containers. And of course, the area behind it hasn't been elevated, so water comes in, and they have to deal with that problem. Now, barriers to adaptation, the port doesn't see any barriers. They can continue to do this for eternity. As they say, the government will pay. Well, so obviously they don't see any technological, cost-benefit, financial, social barriers. A different port, so here you can see the little concrete pathway is how they access the ships. This area where the mangroves are used to be land, now it's underwater. These mangroves do seem to be compensating for 10 centimeters land subsidence per year. So I would like somebody to drive a core through them and tell me how they're doing that. Maybe there are plastic bottles underneath, and the mangroves are just using waste to... Anyway, they don't see any problems. They continue to do this. They've raised the port several times. They do this sequentially when they get money. Again, sheet piles, rubble on top, resurface. They don't see any barriers again, but they're saying at one point maybe it's just better to move to a floating port because the government will pay, but maybe it's more cost-efficient to do something else. So Muaranke Port, again, they're compensating for about 7 centimeters of subsidence per year. They've raised the port several times, and in this video, you can actually see the sequence. So what you see is 3 different pathways, if you want, at 3 different levels. You can see some of the reclaimed land in the back. But as I go back, you'll see the elevated section is the one that was completed last. The one in the middle is the one that was done before. And underwater was the original pathway to access the ships. So this is the sequence of adaptation. And here you can see some tetrapods that are now underwater. Again, sheet piles, concrete on top. They don't see any barriers to adaptation, but they also wonder at which point it might be better to just move to a floating port. And they've started to experiment with floating ports. They drive a pile, and then you've got these floating plastic units that just compensate. And here you can see the old section of the port that I was showing you earlier. So In Tohoku, of course, they had to do the same thing. They had to compensate. Here, of course, in Tokyo, the problem becomes that they have to do earthquake countermeasures. So it's a lot more expensive. The technology is different because you need to actually drive piles, very deep piles, to make sure that due to earthquakes, the port doesn't break. So like the side of the port doesn't collapse into the water. So in the case of Tokyo, the engineers say that there are no technological limits. They can continue to do this, but at some point this becomes very expensive because of the earthquake countermeasures. And like in some cases, like if you do by another meter, something like 100 times more expensive. They say that maybe after 4 meters, if they had to do another 4 meters of land subsidence, maybe residents would just say, maybe can we just move somewhere else? But up to 4 meters, they reckon we did some other ports, but in the interest of time. We also quantified how much it would cost to do these things for different ports. So we asked people in Indonesia, we asked in Japan, how much would it cost for the different types? So, and then this is a slide that summarizes that if people are interested. So my conclusions are, people will not migrate just because they get their feet wet. We saw that in the first slide in this presentation. And from this, Jakarta, Tokyo, dense urban areas are not going to retreat. We don't see any evidence of this, and we've looked at other places around the planet. There doesn't seem to be anybody talking about this. Adaptation appears to be sequential, retroactive most of the times nowadays. When you have a problem and you have the money, you solve it. And there are no significant barriers identified by port authorities, up to at least 1 meter of sea level rise, even 2 meters. Jakarta and Tokyo have already adapted to land subsidence of up to 4 meters. So if Jakarta and Tokyo have done it, it's likely that every other city around the planet will adapt. If anything, what you see in these cities is that these cities are advancing. And you see this in countless cities around the planet of land reclamation going into the sea. I'm not saying that all is good. The point I was trying to make with all these cost estimates is that this is all very expensive, and that the cost of this are also always borne by the poorer sectors of society. So often the people inhabiting the areas that are most at risk are poor people. In Jakarta and also in Tokyo, the areas in Tokyo that are under sea level are also the poorer parts of the city. Not that they're poor, but they're the poor, comparatively poorer. And just 2 little slides. We've started a new open access journal. So this is a little bit of promotion for it. It's by TU Delft Open. It's a free journal. It's an open access, but free to publish this. So there's no cost involved for anybody. It's a new initiative that we're hoping to try to break this hold by Elsevier's, bring in all these kind of journals on academia. And finally, a little bit of promotion about all virtual reality headsets, which are in the poster session. So if you want to experience the island I was showing you at the beginning, and that another one of my colleagues will be talking about tomorrow, please come and see your poster session, well, or poster session or display. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, yes, in table 5.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was quite revealing. I have a question. If people don't know what the options are, it's a bit of a stretch to conclude that people will not retreat, right? And I'm just sort of wondering whether the counterfactual was prepared. You said there was no cost estimates done, but what would be the comparative cost of moving people to the hills that were taken down to the sea to fill the sea?
Okay, so of course this is, in this room we're all engineers, scientists, practitioners, and we always think in terms, in abstract terms, of what would be better from an engineering perspective or from a cost perspective for people. But often people don't think like that. People, fishermen, for example, who live in these places say, I want to be close to my boats. So you might say to them, well, it would be better for you to live in the hills and then come to your boat. But these people think, well, I'd prefer to live close to my boats and you live in the hills. So you often miss what people want. And we can say that it would be better to retreat. You can do all the cost estimates in the world, but the people living in these areas, and the same thing happens in Tokyo, they don't want to move. They want to continue to live in the same area. So this is often what we miss as engineers, the connection to people. I mean, I'm from Liverpool in England originally, and if I told my mother that she would have to leave Liverpool because Liverpool is going to be flooded, she would say, no way. we come from here, we're going to continue to inhabit the same city. So there is something very powerful about attachment of people to areas, and people will do anything to stay. So that's why I don't see much evidence of people wanting to move anywhere. And yeah. The cost of sea level rise is borne by the poor, because they will continue to be impoverished, but they will also continue to refuse to move, which is the point, yeah.